Alright. Let's see. Yeah, you guys, you can hear me? Alright, sit, Coach Saunders. Let's do this. This is going to be a 5-minute TED Talk on World War II and what led up to it. So mainly how it started is it started with this man himself, Adolf Hitler. He was born in Austria as an Austrian citizen during a time period where Germany was in many ways in strife. He was a soldier during World War II, was injured and discharged. He was a big fan of the stab in the back theory, in which he believed Jews were the reason Germany led to defeat in the First World War, the war to end all wars. He believed that the Jews conspired and profited off of the German loss, and so as such he was a big anti-Semite and was very angry at the Treaty of Versailles for separating Austria from Germany, and especially he did not like communism. He was not a fan of. He was a fascist. He was a fascist dictator. After he was elected, then he forced himself into the Führer as the Grand Leader. So in the first photo we have German troops walking into the Rhineland, which is an area in the west of Germany, in 1936 when Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. So he basically walked troops into a zone which was forced to be demilitarized by the Germans after World War I. It was close to the border of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, and they were like, you do not allowed to have troops in there. We do not want the Schlieffen Plan to be executed again in any way, shape, or form. And so when this happened, there was protests by those nations, but there was no war. There were no real threats. But it did bring the attention to these people, and as a British newspaper famously stated, it is no more than the Germans walking into their own backyard. And so then Germany, led by Adolf at this time by the Nazi leadership, the National Socialist fascists, annexed Austria in Anschluss, which was the German annexation of Austria in a referendum, heavily influenced by German commandos and the SS. This joined Austria in essentially a peaceful annexation of a separate country, also in violation of the Treaty of Versailles, and once again brought attention from France, Great Britain, and even Italy. Italy believed that Austria was in its sphere of influence, but at the time was seeking that they wanted to maintain a diplomatic relationship between Adolf and Mussolini, who was in charge of Italy at the time, who was also a fascist dictator. So Austria was peacefully annexed by Germany, there were no shots fired, and that's what happened. And so then Germany started making more aggressive moves that were not so appreciated by everyone universally. So Germany demanded the Sudetenland, which was part of Czechoslovakia, the modern-day Czech Republic, and Slovakia. And what happened was they stated that German minority workers in the Sudetenland, which was in the western parts of Czechoslovakia, were being mistreated and deserved to be transferred over into German hands. There was a conference called the Munich Conference between Czechoslovakia, France, and Great Britain in the city of Munich, which is right here. And they all concluded that Czechoslovakia needed to give up the Sudetenland in order to maintain peace. Czechoslovakia, however, was not invited to the conference. They were not allowed to delegate in the conference because obviously they would argue that they did not need to give up, they needed to remain sovereign in these parts. But Germany was very firm. They stated that they were only protecting the workers, and even though France and Great Britain were not in great protest, they did not seek to start a war over such a small piece of land, in an arguably valid excuse for German territorial rights. And then in a move that shocked the world, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was a non-aggression pact between the Soviets and the Germans, that divided the East Poland Romania, modern-day Moldavia, the Baltics, and Finland into Soviet and German spheres of influence. That when Germany told Poland that when they invaded Poland, Germany told the Soviets that when they invaded Poland, it would be divided between them in exchange for a non-aggression pact. At this time, they both mutually needed this. The Nazis did not want to go to war with the Soviets because they still needed their oil and not necessarily support, but their they needed their peace. That way they could focus on the West when the Allied powers began to intervene in their affairs. And the Soviets were dealing with the effects of the Great Purge, where Stalin killed many of his high command, which destroyed his top command and greatly weakened his ability to fight a efficient war, as demonstrated in the Winter War between them and the and the Finnish, where they greatly received numerous losses, but in the end still remained victorious because they're a very large country versus Finland. But it was still obvious that they needed to repair their central command. So the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was important for both countries, but allowed Germany to focus all of their efforts in the West while the treaty was active. And then Germany, after they demanded the city of Memel, which is in Lithuania, in this small corridor right here, they demanded the city of Danzig from Poland in the Polish corridor. And this was when it started. World War II was started because Germany stated that they owned the city of Danzig because they've had it before. It was rightful German territory, and they demanded it from the Poles, and the Poles were not having it. The Polish were said, this is our land, we're not giving it up, and if you want it that badly, we will go to war with it, because they had been told by the Allies, France and Britain, that we will back you up if they try to take it. And Germany, even they knew this, and they were still determined to take Danzig, and because they wanted Poland. So they ended up declaring war for Poland, and they capitulated in only 1 month. And Poland was divided in between the two spheres of influences, and fell very quickly to the German tactics of the Blitzkrieg, which was rapid movements by tanks that were preceded by aerial bombings. And then after the tanks moved in, they were scarce troops that were scattered by the tanks were cut off by land troops that were marching in. So Poland fell very quickly after Germany declared war in September 1939. And then they went around the Maginot Line, which was formed around Strasbourg and Mulhouse and Nancy and Metz. The Maginot Line was essentially the thought that they could build a huge, massive fortifications along natural mountainous terrain on the boundaries of the German border that would serve impenetrable to German attacks. You could throw 1 million men, and 1 million men would be repelled. And so what happened was Germany did another version of the Schlieffen Plan, where they once again marched through Belgium, but importantly they also went through the Netherlands and capitulated both of them rather quickly. And then what happened was, as the English and French were pushing units into Brussels, Rotterdam, Amsterdam in the north, the Germans sent a surprise attack through the Ardennes forest, which is highlighted in the green. And what happened was they swooped through in the green, cut off Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Brussels, Anversen, Namur, Dinard, in Luxembourg. They cut them all off in a huge swoop through what was thought to be an impassable terrain from the Ardennes forest. So they swooped through in a zone that was undefended and surrounded all of the northern armies in the famous encirculation of Dunkirk. In the end, a few hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions, escaped from Dunkirk, but in the end it was still crushing to the northern defense of France, and as such Paris was captured, and the Nazi regime established the Free Zone, which was also called Vichy France. And Vichy France was a semi-sovereign nation that was, in actuality, a puppet of Nazi Germany, the German Reich, and was headed by Philip Pétain. And this was so they could seem as if they were just taking valid parts of land that they deserved to own. And so then they conquered northern France, said they owned it, gave a little bit of province in Savoy to Italy, and that's where what happened. The French capitulated, and their African territories remained sovereign in French control, and the English were now left alone to face off against the Grand Reich and the Italians in what named is the Battle of Britain. The Battle of Britain was fought between air powers, between the English and all of the Axis powers, which in time encompassed Hungary, Romania, and the small nation of Slovakia, which was created after the annexation of Czechoslovakia. After the annexation of Czechoslovakia happened before the Molotov-Ribbentrop, and so they peacefully annexed it and created a puppet state called Slovakia. And the Axis bombed the heck out of the English Isles, but in the end were held off by the Royal Air Force. So the Luftwaffe, which was the German Air Force, proved incapable of sieging down the English by means of aerial attacks only. And this shocked Hitler, who was believing in Hermann Göring, who believed that this would be the way they could end the war and force a surrender from the English. And then things began to take a slight turn in the not favor of the Germans. In a violation of the Treaty of Molotov-Ribbentrop, they attacked the Soviet Union and also named the USSR in a modern-day operation, which is the biggest land operation in the history of the world, called Operation Barbarossa. And what happened was they marched deep into Russia in 1941, deep into Russia, through Romania, through Poland, through the Ostprussen, which is East Prussia, and deep into Russia. They reached Leningrad, surrounded it. They reached Sevastopol, Minsk, Kiev, and they reached the front lines of Stalingrad and were within a mile of Moscow. And the first few months of the war were just resounding successes by the Germans. It was very, very, very effective encapsulations. The biggest encirclement in the world happened, encircling, I believe, 2 million people, and eventually leading to most of their demise. But what happened is the supply lines began to become too long, the winters and the muddy terrain proved too much, and eventually it became very far urban fighting with low supplies. So this is German soldiers in the city of Stalingrad, viewing a burning building and pushing up. German planes headed by the Luftwaffe and Hermann Göring bombed Russian cities to the ground, so much so that it was mainly just flat land and broken rubble. And as such, the fighting was very intense. This proved also very difficult to get German tanks into the city, as most of the terrain was no longer flat, and the roads were very heavily damaged. And so it mainly began to be urban combat, searching building to building, pushing to the banks of the Volga River, which is where Stalingrad was situated. And then in 1942, on December 7th, a day that will live in infamy, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Emperor Hirohito dispatched planes that bombed ships in the American Pearl Harbor, destroying many ships, but not destroying the cruisers which were out on trading that day. And essentially initiating a declaration of war between the two countries. This led Germany to declare war on the U.S., which cut off most of their oil, and then at this point in time, Germany's oil supply began to run extremely low, and they needed an out, or they would be soon destroyed. Japan very quickly realized they were too little against the American people, who at this time were not in the war, but this started the war for the American people. This entire time, Italy had been fighting in Africa. They had surrounded the city of Tobruk. because they needed to seize the Suez Canal and create a Roman Empire look-alike. Mussolini was a big fan of the Roman Empire, sought to make himself Augustus once again, and as such, when Rommel's tanks, the Desert Fox, as the German command called them, and his enemies, surrounded the city of Tobruk, but English troops and Australian troops held the ground, and even though the city was encircled, it was defended to the last man and was never fully captured. So as such, the war in Africa became a back and forth between El Alamein and Badr Hakim, back and forth, but with eventually the English and American troops pushing the Italians out of Libya, and this led into the invasion of Sicily, the reinforcement of Greece, and eventually the encapsulation of Sicily, Italy, and the marches into southern France during the time of D-Day. Sicily was fully controlled by the Allies soon after this invasion. Sardinia was soon controlled by the Allies, and Rome was soon to come. The Allies quickly marched through the soft underbelly of Europe, as they were called, and Mussolini was overthrown by his own people, held captive, and then released. And then Italy was set free, and then only the north was under Mussolini's control. And then in the north of France, in the town of near the town of Normandy, American, Canadian, Australian, and English and French troops descended into what can only be described as vicious, hellish fighting on the beaches of the coast. They attacked with little to no cover, no tanks, because they were being lost in sea, against German defenses. In the middle of the night, Hitler was awoken, told that the Americans and the Allies were invading, and he did not let the tanks move in. He believed that the main attack was still going to be coming from Pas de Calais, which was closer to the English Channel, and closer to Dover, which is on the east side of the English Isles. So he did not want to move his tanks somewhere that he thought would not be the full brunt of the attack. But the Allies had foresaw this and pushed as many men as they could into the northern parts of Normandy, and eventually reached Paris, liberating it. And then ensued the Battle of the Bulge, which was a recreation of the around the Maginot Plan, where they once again pushed through the Ardennes forest and tried to go through north and cut off all of the armies that were in the north of the Dutch and Belgium area, and attempted to once again surround them and cut them off in a last-ditch attempt by Adolf. This was seen by suicidal by many of his generals, and proved to be once again suicidal, even though they did go extremely far into their goal, capturing Sels, March, not capturing Bastogne, even though they surrounded it, and they did not end up reaching their goal of how far they wanted to push into the Netherlands. And so this ended up not being enough. The suicidal attack was repelled, and as such, Germany was separated into the West and the East. The West was democratic, and the East was powered by the Soviets. And Berlin itself, which is the Yellow Territory, was developed also in West and East. Once again, West being democratic, East being communist, once again. This was seen by the Yalta Conference, which sought the Big Four, Franklin Delano, Stalin, and Winston Churchill, all meeting and declaring that this would be the best solution. And then, after the victory in the West, needed to come the victory in the East, where America nuked Japan in two cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and as such brought the end of World War II in the East. This shaped the world in a way that is still relevant today, and was very important, as Emperor Hirohito famously stated after Soviet troops marched into Manchuria, the war has not necessarily uh, ended in Japan's favor. And as such, the Japanese surrendered to the Americans before they set foot on their isles. And as such, World War II was ended. In the end, over 50 million people lost their lives. And it was the bloodiest war and the bloodiest battles that have ever happened to the human race on this earth, and serves as a lesson to what happens when you let somebody insane run your country, and somebody that is based off of fear and anger lead your national politics.